July 4, 1944. Ramitelli Air Base, Italy. The scorching Mediterranean sun beat down on the tarmac where 24 P-51 Mustangs sat grounded, their engines refusing to start after the previous day's mission over Munich. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. paced anxiously near the operations building, knowing that Allied bombers would soon be heading into heavily defended German airspace without their red tail escort. None of them could have imagined that a mechanic from rural Alabama was about to change the course of the day's battle, and perhaps the war itself. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how Technical Sergeant William Tex Jenkins, a former sharecropper's son with an 8th grade education, would develop an ingenious mechanical solution that not only saved countless bomber crews, but revealed how innovation from overlooked places often creates the most profound transformations in warfare. The pre-dawn darkness still lingered over Ramitelli Air Base as Technical Sergeant William Tex Jenkins made his way across the airfield. At 34, Jenkins was older than most of the men stationed at the base, the lines around his eyes deepened by years of squinting into engines and the Italian sun. His dark hands were permanently stained with aircraft oil, the fingernails perpetually rimmed with black, despite his nightly scrubbing. The other mechanics called them his credential marks, proof of his dedication to keeping the 332nd Fighter Group's planes in the air. Jenkins moved with purpose across the tarmac, his tall frame slightly stooped from years of bending over engines. The distinctive red tails of the P-51 Mustangs gleamed dully in the emerging light, a source of pride for the all-black fighter group known as the Tuskegee Airmen. Though many in the military establishment had predicted failure for the experimental Negro fighter pilot program, the 382nd had proven themselves in combat over and over again, earning a reputation for never losing a bomber they escorted. "Morning, Tex," called Sergeant Isaac Powell, another mechanic already at work on one of the Mustangs. "Colonel's already been by. Big mission today." Jenkins nodded grimly. "Munich again?" "Berlin," Powell replied. "Deep penetration. They'll need every plane we've got." Berlin missions were the most dangerous of all, the longest range, the heaviest defenses, and the highest stakes. The 332nd's perfect record of never losing a bomber under their protection would be severely tested today. "How many airworthy?" Jenkins asked, surveying the line of fighters. "That's the problem," Powell said, lowering his voice despite the fact that no officers were within earshot. "Almost all of them came back with rough engines yesterday. Magneto problems. Lieutenant Wilson says half the squadron might be grounded." Jenkins frowned, his broad forehead creasing with concern. Before the war, he'd been a mechanic at a small airfield in Alabama, working on crop dusters and the occasional private plane. The white owners had been surprised by his natural aptitude for engines, but not surprised enough to pay him more than half what the white mechanics earned. When the war came, and he heard about the training program for Negro pilots at Tuskegee, he'd volunteered immediately, hoping to fly. At 31, they deemed him too old for pilot training, but his mechanical skills had earned him a place as a ground crew chief. "Let me take a look," Jenkins said, heading toward the nearest Mustang where Lieutenant James Wilson, the engineering officer, stood with a clipboard looking frustrated. "Morning, Sergeant Jenkins," Wilson said, his tone grim. "Got ourselves a real situation here." Lieutenant Wilson was one of the few white officers assigned to the 332nd. Initially, many of the black airmen had been suspicious of him, but Wilson had proven himself to be fair and respectful, a rarity in an army still plagued by racial prejudice. More importantly to Jenkins, Wilson knew machines and respected those who could fix them, regardless of color. "What exactly are we dealing with, sir?" Jenkins asked. Wilson gestured to the line of fighters. 23 planes with the same issue. Magneto's failing to generate proper spark at high altitudes. They all made it back yesterday, but it was touch and go. Manifold pressure dropping, engines running rough above 20,000 feet. And now we've got orders to escort the heavies all the way to Berlin today. Jenkins whistled softly. Berlin was almost 1,000 miles from their base in Italy. The bombers would be counting on the Red Tail's protection. "Standard protocols aren't working," Wilson continued. "We've replaced magnetos on 3 planes already, and it takes nearly 4 hours per aircraft. At this rate, we'll be lucky to get a quarter of the squadron airborne by mission time." Jenkins nodded, mentally calculating. "Permission to check one of the engines myself, sir." "Be my guest," Wilson said, gesturing to the nearest P-51. "That's Captain Richardson's plane. Engine started running rough at 25, 0 feet yesterday, nearly conked out over the Alps on the way back." Jenkins moved to the sleek fighter, admiring its lines despite the urgency of the situation. The P-51 Mustang was a beautiful machine, especially with the distinctive red paint on the tail that identified the 332nd. He climbed onto the wing and leaned into the engine compartment, inhaling the familiar smell of oil, metal, and aviation fuel. As the early morning light strengthened, other pilots and ground crew began to appear on the flight line. The mood was tense. Word of the mechanical problems had spread quickly. Captain Lawrence Richardson approached his plane, his expression concerned as he watched Jenkins working. "Morning, Tex," Richardson said. "Can you fix her?" Jenkins straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Working on it, sir. Same problem as yesterday." Richardson nodded. "Engine started missing at high altitude, lost almost 1,000 feet before I could get her stabilized. If we'd been in combat at that moment." He left the sentence unfinished, but both men knew what he meant. A fighter with a faltering engine was vulnerable, and vulnerability in combat usually meant death. "I'll figure it out, sir," Jenkins promised, though he wasn't yet sure if he could keep that promise. As the sun rose higher, Lieutenant Colonel Davis arrived at the flight line, his face set in determined lines. As the commander of the 332nd Fighter Group, Davis carried not only the responsibility for his men's lives, but the weight of proving that black pilots could succeed in combat roles, despite the Army Air Force's reluctance to give them the chance. "Lieutenant Wilson, status report," Davis demanded. "Not good, sir," Wilson admitted. "Same magneto issue across most of the squadron. Standard repairs would take all day, and 15th Air Force needs our escort in 5 hours. Davis's jaw tightened. "The bombers are counting on us. We've never let them down before, and we're not starting today. Options." The group fell silent. In the background, maintenance crews worked frantically on other fighters, but everyone within earshot knew the gravity of the situation. Jenkins cleared his throat. "Sir, I might have an idea, but it's unorthodox." Davis turned to him. "Sergeant Jenkins, isn't it? You're the one from that civilian airfield in Alabama?" "Yes, sir," Jenkins replied, surprised that the commander knew this detail about him. "Well, I'm interested in your unorthodox idea, Sergeant. Proceed." Jenkins hesitated, suddenly aware of the attention focused on him. In his experience, suggesting new methods to white officers had often led to punishment rather than praise. But Davis wasn't like the white officers he'd known before the war. "Sir, I think we're dealing with condensation in the magnetos. Yesterday's mission took the planes through cold, humid air at high altitude, then rapidly back to warm air. Creates condensation inside the magneto housing, which disrupts the electrical connections." Wilson frowned. "That's what we suspected, but the technical manual calls for complete replacement or a full disassembly and drying process. Either way takes hours per aircraft." Jenkins nodded. "Yes, sir, but back in Alabama, we had a similar problem with crop dusters during the humid seasons. Found a way to dry out electrical components without disassembly." Davis raised an eyebrow. "Go on, Sergeant." "We'd use a mixture of pure alcohol and compressed air, sir. The alcohol displaces the water and evaporates quickly with the air pressure, leaving the electrical components dry and functional. Takes about 15 minutes instead of 4 hours. "Is that procedure in the technical manuals, Lieutenant Wilson?" Davis asked. Wilson shook his head. "No, sir. Nothing like that in the Army Air Force maintenance protocols." Davis looked back at Jenkins. "Any risk to the aircraft or pilots?" "Minimal, sir," Jenkins said confidently. "Alcohol doesn't damage the electrical components, and it evaporates completely. We used it for years without incident on civilian aircraft." Davis considered this for a moment, while the group waited tensely. Finally, he turned to Wilson. "Let the sergeant try his method on one aircraft. Test it thoroughly before we attempt any others." "Yes, sir," Wilson replied, though he looked skeptical. As Davis walked away to attend to other matters, Jenkins turned to his fellow mechanics. "I need pure alcohol from medical supplies, compressed air lines, and some rubber tubing," he said. "And someone find me a pressure gauge. We need to get this exactly right." While the other mechanics hurried to gather supplies, Jenkins began examining Captain Richardson's Mustang more carefully. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that powered the P-51 was a marvel of engineering, delivering over 1,500 horsepower when properly tuned. But like all precision machines, it could be temperamental. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams returned with a medical kit. "Got the alcohol techs. Medical officer wasn't happy about it, but I told him Colonel Davis authorized it." "Thanks, Marcus," Jenkins said, taking the bottle. "Now I need to fabricate a delivery system." Over the next 30 minutes, Jenkins created a simple but ingenious apparatus, a metal tube with a fine nozzle that could direct a precise spray of alcohol connected to the base's compressed air system through a pressure regulator he'd modified from spare parts. It wasn't pretty, but Jenkins believed it would work. By now, a small crowd had gathered to watch. Among them was First Lieutenant Jesse Thomas, one of the squadron's most experienced pilots. Thomas had flown 37 combat missions and was respected by everyone in the 382nd. If anyone was skeptical about trusting their life to an improvised maintenance procedure, it would be him. "You really think this will work, Tex?" Thomas asked, watching as Jenkins prepared to apply his solution to Richardson's plane. "It will work," Jenkins replied with quiet confidence. "Physics is physics, regardless of what the manual says." With careful precision, Jenkins inserted the nozzle into small access ports near the magneto housing and began applying his alcohol-air mixture. The compressed air created a fine mist of alcohol that penetrated deep into the electrical components, displacing moisture and rapidly evaporating. Lieutenant Wilson observed closely, his initial skepticism giving way to professional curiosity. "The theory makes sense," he admitted, "but the Army Air Force has procedures for a reason." "With respect, sir," Jenkins said as he worked, "those procedures were written by people who never had to keep crop dusters flying during Alabama summers, with no replacement parts, and plantation owners demanding their fields be sprayed the same day." This drew a few chuckles from the other mechanics, all of whom had experienced the frustration of by-the-book procedures that didn't always address real-world problems. After applying the treatment to both magnetos, Jenkins stepped back. "Let's fire her up." Captain Richardson climbed into the cockpit while the ground crew cleared the area. There was a moment of tense silence. Then the Merlin engine roared to life, running smoother than it had since before yesterday's mission. "Magnetos test normal," Richardson called from the cockpit after running through the standard checks. "Seems good at ground level, but the real test will be at altitude." Lieutenant Wilson nodded. "We'll need to test it properly before trusting it in combat." "I'll take her up," offered Lieutenant Thomas, stepping forward. "Push her to 30,000 feet, put her through some hard maneuvers, and see if the fix holds." Colonel Davis, who had returned to check on progress, considered this for a moment before nodding. "Proceed, Lieutenant, but at the first sign of trouble, return to base immediately." As Thomas prepared for the test flight, Jenkins briefly explained his procedure to the other mechanics. "The key is getting the right mixture and pressure," he said. "Too much alcohol wastes supplies and could potentially cause other issues. Too little won't displace all the moisture." Within minutes, Thomas was airborne, the Mustang climbing rapidly into the clear Italian sky. The ground crew watched until the fighter was just a speck, then turned their attention to the radio where they could hear Thomas's reports. "Passing 15,000 feet, engine running smooth," came Thomas's voice, slightly distorted by radio static. "Oil pressure normal, manifold pressure holding steady." Jenkins stood with his arms folded, outwardly calm but inwardly tense. His reputation, and potentially the success of today's critical mission, rested on whether his improvised solution would work. 20,000 feet, Thomas reported, still smooth. This is where Richardson reported problems yesterday. The group waited, barely breathing. 25,000 feet, running some hard turns now to put stress on the engine. There was a pause that seemed to stretch forever. Engine performance nominal under stress. No missing, no power loss. A ripple of excitement passed through the gathered men, but Jenkins remained focused on the radio. 30,000 feet, Thomas finally reported. Full power test and engine responding perfectly. Whatever Tex did, it worked. I'll head back down now. A cheer went up from the mechanics, and Lieutenant Wilson clapped Jenkins on the shoulder, a gesture that would have been unthinkable in many other units where racial barriers remained rigid. When Thomas landed 15 minutes later, his face was split with a wide grin. "Ran like a Swiss watch," he announced as he climbed down from the cockpit. "Better than before yesterday's mission, even." Colonel Davis, who had remained to hear the results personally, turned to Jenkins. "How quickly can you apply this procedure to the rest of the squadron?" Jenkins did a quick mental calculation. "With 5 teams working in parallel, so we could have all 23 aircraft ready in under 2 hours. Davis nodded decisively. "Lieutenant Wilson, organize the mechanics into teams. Sergeant Jenkins will supervise. I want every aircraft flight ready in 90 minutes. "Yes, sir," Wilson responded, his earlier skepticism completely gone. As Davis walked away, Captain Richardson approached Jenkins. "That was good thinking. Tex, where did you learn to work on engines like that?" Jenkins shrugged slightly. "My father was a sharecropper, but he was good with machines, could fix anything with an engine. During planting season, when the white farmers' tractors broke down, they'd call for him instead of taking them to town. Never paid him what they'd pay a white mechanic, but he taught me everything he knew." Richardson nodded thoughtfully. "The Army teaches us that there's only one way to do things, by the book, but sometimes the book doesn't have all the answers." "No, sir," Jenkins agreed. "Sometimes you have to write your own page." As the morning progressed, Jenkins's procedure was applied to aircraft after aircraft. The other mechanics quickly learned the technique, and soon the flight line was a hive of coordinated activity. Jenkins moved from plane to plane, checking the work, offering advice, and occasionally making adjustments to the equipment they were using. Private First Class Robert Johnson, the youngest mechanic in the unit at just 19, worked alongside Jenkins on several planes. "Where I'm from in Georgia," Johnson said as they finished another aircraft, "they wouldn't let colored folks even touch an airplane, let alone fix one. Said we didn't have the brains for technical work." Jenkins smiled slightly. "People have a way of underestimating what they don't understand. Their loss becomes our advantage." By 10:30 hours, all 23 affected aircraft had been treated using Jenkins's method. Each one started perfectly, their engines running smoothly. Lieutenant Wilson conducted thorough ground tests on each plane, and by 1100 hours, he was able to report to Colonel Davis that the entire squadron was flight ready. Davis called the pilots together for a final briefing before the mission. The operations room was crowded, filled with the men who would soon be risking their lives over hostile territory. "Gentlemen," Davis began, "today's mission is critical. The bombers are hitting aircraft factories in Berlin, the heart of the German war machine. They'll be facing the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots defending their capital. Our job is to make sure those bombers return home." He paused, looking around the room at the faces of his men. "You all know we had a serious maintenance issue this morning. I'm pleased to report that thanks to the innovative thinking of Technical Sergeant Jenkins and the hard work of our ground crews, all aircraft are now fully operational." There was a murmur of appreciation from the pilots, many of whom had been concerned about flying with potentially faulty engines. "I want to emphasize something," Davis continued. "What happened this morning exemplifies what this group is all about. When faced with obstacles, we find solutions. When told something can't be done, we find a way to do it. The 332nd has never lost a bomber under our protection, and today will be no exception." As the briefing concluded and the pilots began to file out, many of them stopped to thank Jenkins, who stood quietly at the back of the room. It was unusual for a non-commissioned officer, particularly a mechanic, to be present at a mission briefing, but Colonel Davis had specifically requested his attendance. Captain Andrew Collins, the squadron's executive officer, approached Jenkins with an extended hand. "The success of this mission depends as much on you as on any pilot flying today," he said as they shook hands. "Thank you, Sergeant." Jenkins nodded, somewhat uncomfortable with the attention, but proud nonetheless. "Just doing my job, sir." Outside, the pilots began their pre-flight checks, while ground crews made final preparations. The distinctive sound of 24 Merlin engines firing to life filled the air. each one running smoothly thanks to Jenkins's innovation. From the sidelines, Jenkins watched as the P-51s taxied to the runway, their red tails gleaming in the midday sun. One by one they took off, climbing rapidly before forming up and setting course for their rendezvous with the bomber stream heading toward Berlin. Lieutenant Wilson stood beside him, watching the last fighter disappear into the distance. "That was quick thinking, Sergeant," he said. "I've been working on aircraft for 12 years and I never would have considered that solution." Jenkins shrugged. "Different experiences lead to different solutions, sir. In Alabama, we couldn't just order new parts when something broke. We had to improvise." Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "I think there's a lesson in that for the whole Army Air Force. Maybe I'll write it up for the technical bulletins when this mission is over." As the sound of the engines faded, the ground crews began the waiting game that was all too familiar. Hours of anxiety until their aircraft and pilots returned. Jenkins kept himself busy inspecting other planes, preparing for future missions, but his mind remained on the 23 Mustangs, heading toward the most heavily defended target in Europe. In the officers' mess, Jenkins found himself approached by Major General Nathan Brooks, the commander of the 15th Air Force Fighter Command, who was visiting Ramitelli that day. It was rare for such a high-ranking officer to address an enlisted man directly, especially a black enlisted man in the segregated military of 1944. "Sergeant Jenkins," the general said, "Colonel Davis told me about your innovative solution this morning. Most impressive." Jenkins stood at attention. "Thank you, sir." Brooks studied him for a moment. "Where did you receive your engineering training, Sergeant?" "I didn't, sir," Jenkins replied. "8th grade education. Learned mechanics working on farm equipment and civilian aircraft in Alabama." The general's eyebrows rose slightly. "Self-taught, then. Sometimes those make the best engineers. They're not constrained by conventional thinking." He paused. "If your solution proves successful in combat conditions today, I'd like you to document the procedure for distribution to other fighter groups. We may have similar issues elsewhere." "Yes, sir," Jenkins said, surprised by the request. The idea that his improvised technique might be adopted throughout the Air Force was both gratifying and somewhat intimidating. The general nodded and moved on, leaving Jenkins to reflect on how far he had come from the dusty airfield in Alabama, where he had first learned to love aircraft engines. The hours passed slowly. In the radio room, operators maintained contact with the mission as best they could, tracking the progress of the bomber formation and their fighter escorts. Initial reports were positive. The 382nd had successfully rendezvoused with the bombers and were proceeding toward the target. At 14:30 hours, word came that the formation had reached Berlin and the bombers were beginning their bomb runs. German fighter opposition was heavy, with over 100 enemy aircraft rising to defend their capital. The radio operators reported hearing the controlled chaos of aerial combat, terse commands, warnings about enemy positions, and occasional confirmations of enemy aircraft destroyed. Jenkins paced outside the radio room, unable to concentrate on other tasks while the fate of his handiwork, and the men trusting their lives to it, remained unknown. Lieutenant Wilson joined him, equally anxious despite his professional demeanor. "No reports of mechanical failures," Wilson said, attempting to sound optimistic. "That's a good sign." Jenkins nodded but remained tense. The true test would come during combat, when engines were pushed to their limits during high-speed maneuvers at extreme altitudes. At 15:15 hours, the radio crackled with a new transmission. "Ramitelli Base, this is Red Leader. Bombs away, all aircraft. Heavy flak, heavy fighter opposition. We're engaging. Over." That was Colonel Davis's voice, calm despite the danger he was facing. The next 30 minutes brought intermittent updates as the battle over Berlin raged. Jenkins listened to each one, searching for any hint that his solution had failed, that an engine had quit at a critical moment, potentially dooming a pilot and endangering the bombers they protected. Finally, at 15:45 hours, Ramitelli, Red Leader. Bombers clear of target area. All red tails present and accounted for. Enemy fighters disengaging. We're heading home. Over. A cheer went up in the radio room, quickly stifled by the operators who needed to maintain communication discipline. But the news spread rapidly across the base. The mission had been successful and all pilots were returning. They made it through the worst part, Wilson said, relief evident in his voice. If the engines held up during combat, they should be fine for the return journey. Jenkins nodded, finally allowing himself to relax slightly. They'll still be pushing hard to get home before dark, not out of danger yet. The wait for the returning aircraft seemed interminable. Jenkins busied himself preparing for their arrival, ensuring that maintenance crews were ready to address any issues that might have developed during the mission. But his primary concern, the magneto problem, appeared to have been solved. Finally, at 17:45 hours, the distant drone of Merlin engines announced the squadron's return. Ground personnel rushed to their positions as the first P-51s appeared in the distance, their distinctive silhouettes a welcome sight against the late afternoon sky. One by one, the Mustangs landed, taxied to their hard stands, and shut down. As each pilot emerged from their cockpit, Jenkins watched their faces, looking for signs of the terror that would have accompanied an engine failure over enemy territory. But what he saw instead was exhilaration mixed with exhaustion, the normal expressions of men returning from a successful but demanding combat mission. Colonel Davis was among the last to land. As he climbed down from his aircraft, he was immediately approached by General Brooks, who had waited for the squadron's return. Jenkins couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see the general nodding approvingly as Davis gestured animatedly, presumably describing the mission. Captain Richardson found Jenkins among the ground crew. His flight suit was soaked with sweat, his face drawn with fatigue, but his eyes were bright. "Your fix worked perfectly, Tex," he said, clapping the mechanic on the shoulder. "Engine ran smoother than silk, even when I was pulling 6 Gs chasing a 109 through a dive." Jenkins felt a surge of pride. "Glad to hear it, sir. Any issues at all?" Richardson shook his head. "Not a hiccup, and from what I heard on the radio, none of the other planes had problems either. You saved the mission, Sergeant." Similar reports came from other pilots as they completed their debriefings. Not a single aircraft had experienced magneto issues during the mission, despite operating in conditions even more demanding than the previous day's flight. As the debriefings concluded and the pilots dispersed to get much-needed rest, Colonel Davis sought out Jenkins, who was helping inspect one of the returned aircraft. "Sergeant Jenkins," Davis called. "A word, please." Jenkins approached, standing at attention before his commanding officer. "At ease, Sergeant," Davis said. "I wanted to personally thank you for your initiative today. Your solution enabled us to complete a vital mission that might otherwise have failed." "Just doing my job, sir," Jenkins replied. Davis smiled slightly. "Your job was to follow the technical manual. What you did went far beyond that." He paused. "General Brooks was impressed. He's recommended you for the Bronze Star." Jenkins blinked in surprise. The Bronze Star was a significant decoration and rarely awarded to ground personnel, let alone black ground personnel. "Thank you, sir," he managed to say. "You earned it," Davis replied simply. "But more importantly, you've demonstrated something I've been saying since this unit was formed. Given the opportunity, Negro personnel can contribute at the highest levels in every aspect of air combat operations." As Colonel Davis walked away, Lieutenant Wilson approached. "The General wants your procedure documented immediately," he said. "We're sending the details by teletype to all 15th Air Force fighter bases tonight. Your name will be on it." Jenkins nodded, still processing the events of the day. "I'll write it up right away, sir." That evening, as darkness fell over Ramitelli, Jenkins sat in the maintenance office, carefully documenting each step of his procedure. He described the exact mixture of alcohol and air, the pressure settings, the application technique, and the expected results. Lieutenant Wilson reviewed the document, made a few minor suggestions, and then sent it to headquarters via teletype. Later, in the NCO mess hall, Jenkins found himself surrounded by both mechanics and pilots, all eager to hear more about his ingenious solution. It was unusual for the two groups to mix so freely. Pilots typically kept to themselves, their status as officers creating a natural separation from enlisted personnel. But tonight, that barrier seemed less significant. "You know what impressed me most?" Lieutenant Thomas said, gesturing with his coffee cup. "Not just that it worked, but how quickly you came up with it." Most of us were still standing around scratching our heads while you were already building your contraption. Jenkins shrugged modestly. When you grow up without resources, you learn to think differently about problems. My father used to say, if you can't get what you need, you make what you have work. Well, your father sounds like a wise man, Thomas replied. His wisdom saved a lot of lives today. As the evening progressed, Jenkins found himself the reluctant center of attention, with men from across the base stopping by to congratulate him or hear the story firsthand. It was a novel experience for a man who had spent most of his military career, and indeed most of his life, being overlooked or underestimated because of his race. Staff Sergeant Powell, who had been working alongside Jenkins that morning, shook his head in amazement. You know, the Army spent millions of dollars training engineers who write those technical manuals, and here you come along with an 8th grade education and solve in 15 minutes what their procedures couldn't fix in 4 hours. Different kinds of education, Jenkins replied. They had classrooms. I had necessity. Across the room, Jenkins noticed Private Johnson talking animatedly with several other young mechanics, occasionally glancing in his direction. Johnson had been one of the most eager to learn the new technique, absorbing every detail as Jenkins demonstrated it. As the crowd around Jenkins thinned, Johnson approached somewhat hesitantly. Sergeant Jenkins, he said, I was wondering if you might teach me some of your other techniques, the ones that aren't in the manuals. Jenkins studied the young man thoughtfully. Johnson reminded him of himself 20 years earlier, eager to learn, quick with his hands, and limited more by opportunity than ability. Come by the maintenance hangar tomorrow afternoon, Jenkins said. I'll show you what I know. Johnson's face lit up. Thank you, Sergeant, I'll be there. As Johnson walked away, Captain Richardson, who had overheard the exchange, settled into the seat beside Jenkins. You're going to have quite a following now, he observed. The man who saved the Berlin mission. Jenkins shook his head. You pilots saved the mission, I just made sure your engines kept running. Richardson laughed. A minor contribution, clearly. His expression grew more serious. You know, Tex, when this war is over, men with your skills and ingenuity will be in high demand. Have you thought about what you'll do? The question caught Jenkins by surprise. Like most servicemen, he thought mainly of surviving the war, with only vague ideas about what might come after. Before the war, his options had been severely limited by segregation and prejudice. Would things be different afterward? Not sure, sir, he admitted. Maybe go back to Alabama, open my own repair shop if they'll let me, or head north where there might be more opportunities. Richardson nodded. The airlines will be expanding after the war. They'll need men who know aircraft inside and out. He paused. It won't be easy. There's still plenty of prejudice in civilian aviation. But after what you've proven here, anyone would be a fool not to hire you. Jenkins appreciated the sentiment, though he remained realistic about the challenges that would await him in post-war America. But today had shown what was possible when skill and opportunity met, regardless of race. As the evening wound down, Jenkins made his way back to his quarters, unusually thoughtful. The day's events had changed something fundamental in how he viewed himself and his future. He had always known his own worth as a mechanic, but today others had recognized it too, from the youngest private to a major general. The next morning, Jenkins was surprised to find Colonel Davis and General Brooks waiting for him at the maintenance hangar. With them was a photographer from Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper. Sergeant Jenkins, General Brooks greeted him. We'd like to document your maintenance procedure for distribution throughout the European theater. The photographer will take pictures while you demonstrate. Jenkins nodded, slightly uncomfortable with the attention but understanding the importance. Yes, sir. I'll set it up right away. Over the next hour, Jenkins demonstrated his technique on one of the Mustangs, explaining each step in detail while the photographer captured images. Colonel Davis and General Brooks observed closely, occasionally asking questions about specific aspects of the procedure. When the demonstration was complete, General Brooks turned to Jenkins. Impressive work, Sergeant. I've already received reports that your procedure has been successfully implemented at 3 other fighter bases. You've potentially saved the Air Force thousands of maintenance hours and, more importantly, made our aircraft more reliable in combat. Thank you, sir, Jenkins replied. One more thing, Brooks added. I've arranged for you to travel to Wright Field next month to work with the engineering staff there. They're interested in incorporating your technique into the official maintenance manuals, and they'd like your input on other potential improvements." Jenkins was momentarily speechless. Wright Field in Ohio was the Army Air Force's primary research and development center. The idea that he would be consulted by the engineers there was almost unimaginable. "It's an unusual arrangement," Brooks acknowledged. "But these are unusual times. The war demands that we utilize every asset available to us, regardless of conventional thinking." As the general and colonel departed, Jenkins stood for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Lieutenant Wilson approached, smiling slightly. "Congratulations, Sergeant. Not many enlisted men get invited to consult at Wright Field." "No, sir," Jenkins agreed, "especially not colored enlisted men." Wilson's expression grew more serious. "Things are changing, Tex. Slowly, maybe, but they are changing. Men like you are forcing the change, proving through actions what no amount of words could accomplish." Throughout the day, Jenkins continued his normal duties, inspecting aircraft and supervising repairs. But there was a subtle difference in how others responded to him, a new level of respect from fellow mechanics, more attentive listening when he spoke, pilots specifically requesting that he check their aircraft before missions. Late in the afternoon, as promised, Private Johnson appeared at the maintenance hangar, eager for the informal training session Jenkins had offered. To Jenkins' surprise, Johnson wasn't alone. 5 other young mechanics had joined him, all hoping to learn the unofficial techniques that had proven so valuable. "I hope you don't mind the extras, Sergeant," Johnson said, looking slightly anxious. "Word got around that you were sharing some of your knowledge." Jenkins surveyed the group, all young, all black, all limited by the same systems that had constrained his own opportunities for education and advancement. Yet here they were, eager to learn, to improve, to excel despite those limitations. "I don't mind at all," he said. "Let's start with the basics. The manual tells you how an engine works in theory. I'm going to show you how it works in practice, when it's been running hot all day and parts are wearing down, when you're low on supplies and high on pressure." For the next 2 hours, Jenkins shared the knowledge he'd accumulated over decades, techniques for diagnosing problems by sound and feel, methods for extending the life of parts that couldn't be immediately replaced, approaches to troubleshooting that began with understanding the underlying principles, rather than just following prescribed steps. The young mechanics absorbed it all, asking questions, taking notes, occasionally demonstrating techniques themselves under Jenkins's watchful eye. It was, Jenkins realized, perhaps the most important maintenance work he had ever done, not just keeping aircraft flying, but ensuring that the knowledge to do so would continue and expand. As the informal class concluded and the mechanics dispersed, Johnson lingered behind. "Sergeant Jenkins," he said hesitantly, "I wanted to thank you, not just for today, but for yesterday, too." Jenkins looked at him questioningly. "What you did with those magnetos," Johnson explained. "It wasn't just about fixing planes. It was about showing what's possible." He paused. "I'm from a small town in Georgia, never thought I'd be working on fighter planes in a war. Never thought I'd see a colored man being consulted by generals either. Makes me think maybe there's more possibilities after the war than I figured." Jenkins nodded, understanding completely. "There will be obstacles," he said honestly. "Always are. But if you know your craft better than anyone else, know it so well they can't ignore your skill, you create your own opportunities." That night, as Jenkins prepared for bed, a message arrived from Colonel Davis's office. His travel orders for Wright Field had been processed. In 3 weeks, he would be temporarily assigned to the engineering division there, the first black non-commissioned officer ever to receive such an assignment. As he lay in his bunk, Jenkins reflected on the strange turns his life had taken, from a sharecropper's farm in Alabama to the heart of the Army Air Force's technical operations. From being told he couldn't be a pilot because of his age to being honored for a mechanical innovation that had helped ensure the success of a critical combat mission. Most of all, he thought about the young mechanics he had taught that afternoon, men who would carry forward not just the specific techniques he had shown them, but the approach to problem-solving that had made those techniques possible. Men who might, in their own ways, continue to expand the boundaries of what was deemed possible for Black Americans in aviation and beyond. The next morning brought news of the Berlin mission's results. The bombing had been successful, with critical damage inflicted on aircraft manufacturing facilities. More significantly, from the 392nd's perspective, not a single bomber under their protection had been lost, despite intense enemy fighter opposition. The Red Tail's perfect escort record remained intact. At the morning briefing, Colonel Davis made a point of connecting this success directly to Jenkins's innovation. "Gentlemen, yesterday's mission demonstrated once again what this unit can accomplish when we combine skill, courage, and ingenuity. Had Sergeant Jenkins not developed his maintenance solution, many of our aircraft would have been grounded, and the bombers would have faced the Luftwaffe without our protection. The likely result would have been significant losses." He paused, looking around at the assembled officers. "I want this example to remind all of you to remain open to new ideas, regardless of their source. Rank and education do not have a monopoly on innovation. Sometimes the most valuable solutions come from unexpected places." In the days that followed, Jenkins's maintenance procedure was adopted throughout the 15th Air Force, then expanded to other theaters of operation. Reports began to filter back of its success in various environments and with different aircraft types. The time savings alone were significant, thousands of maintenance hours redirected to other critical tasks. A week after the Berlin mission, Jenkins received formal notification of his Bronze Star nomination, along with a personal letter from General Brooks praising his exceptional technical skill and innovative thinking under pressure. It was, by any measure, a significant honor for a mechanic who had once been told he couldn't be trusted with complex machines because of his race. Yet for Jenkins, the most meaningful recognition came in less official forms, in the increased confidence of the pilots whose lives depended on his work, in the eager questions from young mechanics who now saw new possibilities for their own futures, in the gradual but unmistakable shift in how he was perceived and treated by all those around him. 2 days before Jenkins was scheduled to depart for Wright Field, Lieutenant Colonel Davis called him to his office. Unlike their previous interactions, which had always occurred on the flight line or in maintenance areas, this was a formal meeting in the commander's headquarters. "Sergeant Jenkins," Davis began once they were seated, "before you leave for your assignment at Wright Field, I wanted to speak with you privately about its significance." Jenkins nodded, listening attentively. "Your work here has implications beyond the immediate military benefits," Davis continued. "As the first Negro fighter group in the Army Air Force, everything the 332nd does is scrutinized, evaluated, compared. Our success or failure isn't just about this war. It's about opportunities for Negro personnel in the military for years to come." "Yes, sir," Jenkins replied. "I understand that." "Your invitation to Wright Field represents another first," Davis said, "another barrier broken. The engineering staff there has always been exclusively white. Your presence will challenge assumptions, just as our pilots have challenged assumptions about Negro capabilities in combat." Jenkins hadn't fully considered this aspect of his assignment. He had viewed it primarily as recognition of his technical skills, not as another front in the broader struggle for equality. "It won't be easy," Davis warned. "There will be resistance, both overt and subtle. Some will question your qualifications, regardless of what you've already proven here. Others will be supportive but unsure how to show it. You'll need to navigate this carefully, maintaining your dignity while still accomplishing the technical mission." Jenkins nodded. "I'll do my best, sir." "I know you will," Davis replied with confidence, "just as you did here." He paused, then added, "Your success at Wright Field could open doors for other Negro personnel in technical specialties throughout the Army Air Force. It's an opportunity not just for you, but for all who might follow." As Jenkins left the colonel's office, he felt the weight of this additional responsibility. It was one thing to develop a mechanical solution under pressure. It was another to represent his race in a previously all-white environment, where every action would be judged not just as his own, but as evidence of black capabilities more broadly. Yet there was pride mixed with the pressure, pride in being chosen, pride in the recognition of his skills, pride in helping to expand the boundaries of what was possible for men who looked like him. On the day of his departure, Jenkins was surprised to find not just his fellow mechanics, but many of the pilots gathered to see him off. Captain Richardson presented him with a small gift, a precision screwdriver set that the officers had pooled their funds to purchase. "For when those fancy engineers at Wright Field need someone to show them how it's really done," Richardson said with a grin. Lieutenant Thomas was more serious. "You represent all of us now, Tex," he said quietly. "Just like we do when we're escorting bombers. Make us proud." Private Johnson, who had attended every informal training session Jenkins had offered in the past weeks, looked almost tearful. "Will you be coming back, Sergeant?" he asked. "That's the plan," Jenkins assured him. "This is just a temporary assignment, and you'd better keep practicing those techniques while I'm gone. I'll be testing you when I return." As the transport aircraft carrying Jenkins took off from Ramitelli, he looked down at the base that had been his home for the past year. The red-tailed Mustangs lined up on the flight line were visible even from altitude, their distinctive markings a symbol of the 332nd's unique identity in the Army Air Force. Jenkins settled back in his seat, mentally preparing for the challenges ahead at Wright Field. He knew that his reception there would be mixed at best, that he would need to prove himself all over again despite his already demonstrated skills. But he also knew something else, that his simple solution to a complex problem had changed not just the operational capabilities of his unit, but perhaps the trajectory of his own life and the lives of others like him. The aircraft banked north, leaving Ramitelli behind. In his pocket, Jenkins carried a small notebook filled with ideas and observations, potential improvements to aircraft maintenance procedures that he had accumulated over months of working on the Mustangs, ideas that, just weeks ago, would have remained unspoken and unimplemented, confined to his own mind by the barriers of race and rank. Now they would be heard, evaluated on their merits rather than their source. It was, he reflected, a small victory in the larger war being fought not just against foreign enemies, but against prejudice and limitation at home. A war that would continue long after the conflict in Europe was resolved. A war fought not with bullets and bombs, but with excellence and persistence, with innovation and undeniable skill. As the Italian countryside passed below, Jenkins thought about what he would say when he arrived at Wright Field, how he would introduce himself and his ideas to the engineers there. He decided it would be simple, direct and true to who he was, a mechanic who had found a better way. In the months that followed, Jenkins's magneto procedure was incorporated into official Army Air Force maintenance manuals and distributed worldwide. His consultations at Wright Field led to several other modifications in aircraft maintenance protocols, each one saving time, resources, and potentially lives. After the war, the impact of his innovation continued to ripple outward. Airlines and aircraft manufacturers adopted variations of his technique, often without knowing its origin or the circumstances of its development. The principles he had demonstrated, that effective solutions could come from practical experience rather than just formal education, that necessity truly was the mother of invention, influenced a generation of aircraft mechanics, both black and white. For Technical Sergeant William Tex Jenkins himself, the recognition he received during the war opened doors that would have remained closed otherwise. After his discharge in 1945, he was hired by one of the major airlines, the first black mechanic in their maintenance division. Others followed, some of them veterans of the 382nd's ground crew who had learned from Jenkins's example. The Jenkins method, as his alcohol air procedure came to be known in some circles, remained in use for years, a testament to the lasting value of a solution born from the unique combination of necessity, experience, and the opportunity, however reluctantly given, to apply his skills. But perhaps the most significant legacy was not technical, but human. Young men like Private Johnson, who had witnessed firsthand what was possible despite the barriers of segregation and prejudice, carried that knowledge forward into their own lives and careers. Some followed Jenkins into civilian aviation, others applied the lesson in different fields. All of them understood that excellence could create its own opportunities, that innovation could come from unexpected places, and that sometimes the most elegant solutions were also the simplest. In the end, the story of how one Tuskegee mechanic's genius shortcut got aircraft flying in minutes became more than just a footnote in the history of the 322nd Fighter Group. It became a parable about innovation, opportunity, and the untapped potential that exists when artificial barriers are removed and skill is allowed to speak for itself. Decades later, when aviation historians wrote about the technological advances of World War II, most focused on the dramatic developments, jet engines, radar, pressurized cabins. Few mentioned the simple but ingenious maintenance procedure developed by a black mechanic with an 8th-grade education on an airfield in Italy. But for the men whose lives were saved because their engines didn't fail at 30,000 feet over enemy territory, for the bomber crews who returned home because their escort fighters remained operational, for the young mechanics who saw new possibilities for their own futures, for them, Technical Sergeant William Tex Jenkins's innovation was among the most significant developments of all. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.